Washington in 22 minutes. This is a story that takes us back to the roots of America's foundation, where the echoes of a brave man's triumph over adversity resonate even today. But before we get started, if you're enjoying our historical deep dives, do hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to never miss an episode. It's once upon a time, in the heart of Virginia, Westmoreland County, on the chilly day of February 22, 1732, the story of a remarkable man, George Washington, began. The son of Augustine Washington, a plantation owner of respectable status, and Mary Ball, George was a descendant of a lineage steeped in a history of determination and resilience. His great-grandfather, John Washington, had battled alongside King Charles I in the English Civil War, emigrated to Virginia, and wedded the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner, marking the beginning of the Washington family legacy in the New World. Imagine this: Virginia, a colony barely a century old, and England's first foothold in the vast expanse of North America. The Atlantic coast was blossoming with colonies, populated by nearly 2 million inhabitants by the mid-18th century, compared to England's 6 million. The American colonies, including places that would become Boston and New York, were a vibrant mix of people from Ireland, Germany, England, and beyond, all drawn to the boundless opportunities offered by the American landscape. Picture vast plantations and busy ports, laden with commodities like tobacco, sugar, and coffee cultivated in abundance and then shipped back to Europe, setting up a vigorous international trade network. Amidst this rich mosaic of colonies and bustling trade, France and England vied for the bountiful North American and Caribbean territories. The wealth of natural resources made England's 13 colonies prosperous, and their prosperity grew with the use of slaves, exploited as a seemingly endless source of unpaid labor. Imagine the life of the colonial landowners, like the Washingtons, a life of elegance, comfort, and relative security. They were colonial gentry, living in an English manner and loyal to the crown. Yet, unlike some of their wealthier counterparts, Augustine and Mary Washington were unable to send their children away for education, making way for young George's initial learning under private tutors. His schooling in Fredericksburg, Virginia, shaped him into a diligent young man, proficient in mathematics and cartography. However, the sudden death of his father in 1743 shook his world, leaving George with a small estate named Ferry Farm, several slaves, and a slice of his father's legacy to share with his siblings. George's eldest half-brother, Lawrence, played a significant role in George's life, taking the reins of the family and mentoring young George. Lawrence's marriage to the daughter of influential colonial official William Fairfax also opened doors for George, offering him the opportunity to become a land surveyor in 1749, marking the first steps of a journey that would lead to him becoming one of the most significant figures in American history. Washington's tenure in Culpeper, Virginia, was brief. In a few years, he acquired land in the Shenandoah Valley and relinquished his Culpeper post. At this time, his brother Lawrence's battle with tuberculosis prompted the brothers to frequently seek solace in the therapeutic hot springs of what is now Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. In 1751, they ventured to Barbados, lured by the promise of a tropical climate's potential health benefits. En route, Washington contracted smallpox, which inadvertently fortified him against future infections. He returned to the mainland with his brother in 1752, but Lawrence's health deteriorated, leading to his death in July of that year. Tragedy struck again 2 years later with the deaths of Lawrence's wife and daughter, resulting in Washington inheriting the Mount Vernon estate. Inspired by Lawrence's military service, Washington pursued an officer's commission. In 1752, Washington received his commission in the Virginia militia and was promptly promoted to major. His duties included protecting trade routes near the Ohio River and safeguarding English territory from French interference. The French claimed territories west of the Appalachian Mountains, known as New France, but the British Crown, propelled by the growing Atlantic colony's population, disputed this claim. Virginia's Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent Washington to warn the French forces in the Ohio River basin to evacuate. Braving dangerous and inhospitable terrain, Washington embarked on this critical mission with a band of frontiersmen and natives. After a month-long journey, they reached the French Fort Le Berthe. The fort's commander redirected Washington to the Major General of New France in Quebec for diplomatic correspondence. On his return to Virginia, Washington encountered native attacks and a near-drowning experience in a frozen river. Despite the challenges, Washington managed to report back to Dinwiddie and received local acclaim for his bravery. His fame quickly spread across America and England, earning him a promotion to lieutenant colonel. However, the imminent war between Britain and France for the Ohio Basin control meant Washington's westward journey was far from over. Both nations vied for the strategic junction around what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where 3 major rivers merged, allowing the swift movement of boats amidst the dense forests. In command of 200 men, Washington was tasked to prevent the French from solidifying their position at the river junction. He learned en route that the French had already started fortifying a fort named Duquesne. Despite this, Washington decided to wait for reinforcements, during which he discovered a nearby French camp. Choosing offense, Washington led an attack that quickly overwhelmed the French forces, claiming about a dozen lives, including the commander Joseph de Jumonville. Some contend that Jumonville, the French commander, was not killed in battle but by Washington's Indian allies. Rumor also circulated that the French were on a peace mission, much like Washington's earlier venture into the Ohio Basin. Regardless, this incident, dubbed the Battle of Jumonville Glen, ignited the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, pitting England and allies like Prussia against a coalition including France, Austria, and Russia. Washington, elevated to a full colonel, anticipated French retaliation. He strengthened his position at Fort Necessity with reinforcements. However, the French commander, Jumonville's brother, sought revenge, launching an attack on the fort. The surrounding woods, which Washington had failed to clear, provided a natural shield for the French to attack his exposed position. Ultimately, Washington surrendered, marking a personal and British defeat. He and his men under the surrender terms retreated to Virginia, a journey marked by disgrace. Complicating matters was the surrender document, which labeled Washington as Jumonville's assassin, a term Washington claimed he misunderstood. Public condemnation followed, blaming him for triggering a war with the French at Jumonville Glen and being responsible for the defeat and retreat. Although many officers' careers might have ended here, Washington persevered. His moment of redemption soon arrived. British General Edward Braddock, tasked with capturing Fort Duquesne, appointed Washington to his staff, valuing his knowledge of the region. Unfortunately, a surprise French and Indian attack ambushed the British force, leading to heavy casualties, including Braddock. Despite being ill, Washington distinguished himself by managing an organized retreat and temporarily leading the British forces after Braddock's demise, which helped restore his reputation. Back in Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie promoted Washington to command the Virginia Regiment, assigned to defend the frontier from Indian raids. Subsequently, in 1757, Scottish General John Forbes, leading a large force, succeeded in capturing Fort Duquesne, which he rebuilt and renamed Fort Pitt in honor of the British Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder. The neighboring settlement evolved into the city of Pittsburgh with the capture of Quebec in 1759. The British gained the upper hand in the American theater of the 7 Years' War, largely thanks to the sheer manpower and resources of the North American colonies. The British colonies, home to about 2 million people, vastly outnumbered the population of New France, under 100,000. This demographic disadvantage played a significant role in the French's eventual defeat. Remember, the majority of soldiers who fought for the British during the French and Indian War were American-born, making it as much a colonial victory as a British one. At the age of 27, in 1758, George Washington chose to step back from the war, resigning his commission to return to his Mount Vernon estate. The following year, he married Martha Parke Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children, elevating his social and financial status and making him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. In the mid-1760s, Washington managed more than 50,000 acres of estate and owned about 1,700 slaves. He entered politics, campaigning for a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses, reputedly offering free alcohol to garner votes. Tragedy struck when his stepdaughter Patsy died in his arms following a severe epileptic seizure. By the 1760s, anti-British sentiment began to brew in the colonies. Washington's own dissatisfaction was initially rooted in personal experiences with British merchants, whom he felt were taking advantage of him in the tobacco trade. His feelings of being treated as a second-class citizen fueled his growing disdain for British rule, as did the British Parliament's prohibition of colonial westward expansion to protect its lucrative fur trade. Further resentment brewed with the passing of the Stamp Act of 1765, which stipulated that all paper goods in the colonies had to be printed on British-made paper and purchased with British currency. The act, seen as a means to make the colonies pay for the French and Indian War, fanned the flames of anti-British sentiment. Although the act was repealed a year later due to the negative impact on British trade, the frustration over taxation without representation remained. Washington, along with many in the colonies, saw these acts as oppressive. The sentiment that it was unjust for England to pass laws over the colonies without colonial representation in the Parliament laid the groundwork for the American Revolution. The growing discontent first surfaced in the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, where representatives from 9 colonies strategized their opposition. In the years that followed, England's Parliament passed further acts that exacerbated the situation, fueling the colonies' desire for autonomy. From the British viewpoint, the 13 colonies were fortunate as they paid significantly less in taxes than Britain and were expected to trade exclusively with Britain. This was perceived as equitable by both sides, though the colonies protested against taxation without consent, setting the stage for a conflict that neither side was willing to back down from. George Washington played a role in organizing resistance to some of England's Parliament's actions in Virginia, including a boycott of British goods. Tensions escalated to a boiling point in March 1770 with the Boston Massacre, where British troops fired on protesters, resulting in several deaths. Boston became the epicenter of the emerging American Revolution, with agitation growing among its citizens, spurred by the likes of Samuel Adams. Adams seized the opportunity to amplify anti-British sentiment using the Boston Massacre. In a defining moment on December 16, 1773, Adams delivered a stirring speech at the South Meeting House in Boston, tapping into the crowd's fears of future taxation. Later that night, 50 men disguised as Mohawk Indians famously dumped a shipload of tea into Boston Harbor in a non-violent protest known today as the Boston Tea Party. The English Parliament reacted by restricting public gatherings in Boston, closing its harbor until the tea was compensated for. These and other measures, dubbed the Intolerable Acts, fueled outrage in Massachusetts and played into the hands of local patriots like Adams. The British General Thomas Gage attempted to calm the situation by seizing the colonial militia's gunpowder supplies, but this only served to escalate tensions. Upon learning of a large weapons cache in the town of Concord, Gage sent about 900 British regulars to seize it. However, the Patriots had their own intelligence network. They sent staff and riders to warn the surrounding towns, rallying the local militia. On April 19, 1775, as the British entered Lexington, they were met by approximately 80 local militiamen who had strategically left the road open to Concord. As the British marched towards the militia, expecting resistance, a British officer ordered both sides to disperse, in a last-ditch attempt to avert a looming conflict. The exact events that transpired next are uncertain, but a conflict ensued in which 8 militiamen lost their lives. The larger tragedy was averted when British Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith intervened to restore order. This incident, the first clash in the forthcoming war, propelled the British forces towards Concord. However, the militia successfully drove them back to Boston. The victories at the Battle of Lexington and Concord marked a point of no return. Either British rule would persist or the 13 colonies would secure their independence. A month after these battles, George Washington attended the Second Continental Congress. The Continental Army composed of the militia units that had engaged the British around Boston. In July 1775, Washington was appointed as the commanding general of the Continental Army. Upon first inspecting his new force in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he was dismayed by its lack of discipline and poor equipment. The British, on the other hand, branded the colonials as traitors, threatening severe punishment upon capture for anyone supporting or participating in the rebellion. In the summer of 1775, despite claiming victory in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British sustained heavy losses that stalled further advancement. By March of the following year, they were forced to evacuate Boston as the Continental Army moved cannons within range of the harbor. Washington then turned his attention to the Loyalist-held New York City. However, British General William Howe occupied Long Island in September 1776. July 1776 holds a special place in American history as the month when the 13 colonies ratified their Declaration of Independence. This momentous document clearly announced the colonies' intent to sever ties with Great Britain, defining the conflict not merely as an uprising, but as a full-fledged revolution for independence. While this was happening, General Howe ascended in New York with a formidable force of 40,000 professional soldiers. Although Washington's force was numerically comparable, they were significantly less trained or disciplined, consisting mainly of armed citizens or militia, misleading by inaccurate intelligence which underestimated the British forces. Washington decided to make a stand. In the days that followed, the British managed to compel the colonials to retreat across the Hudson River. The loyalist populace in New York hailed General Howe as a liberator. Winter 1776 was possibly the gloomiest time for the colonials during the Revolutionary War. Washington's Continental Army, now a meager force of a few thousand poorly equipped and underfed men, was on the brink of collapse. Howe, in a decision that arguably cost him the war, chose to winter in New York, awaiting spring. Nearly a quarter of Howe's forces comprised German mercenaries known as Hessians, several of whom were stationed along the northern bank of the Delaware River at Trenton during the winter of 1776. On Christmas Eve that year, Washington conceived a daring plan to cross the Delaware and ambush the Hessians. The surprise attack, executed on the morning of December 26th, resulted in the demise of the Hessian commander, the capture of hundreds, and the seizure of substantial supplies. The crossing of the Delaware and the success at Trenton, although minor victories, served as significant morale boosters for the Continental Army, infusing them with a renewed sense of purpose. The following summer, the British initiated a large-scale invasion of the 13 colonies from Quebec, led by General John Burgoyne. Meanwhile, Howe, from his base in New York, decided to press towards Philadelphia rather than wait for Burgoyne's forces. Washington moved north to challenge Howe, culminating in the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. Despite the British victory and subsequent occupation of Philadelphia, the triumph was short-lived. To the north, Burgoyne's 7,000-strong army suffered defeat, culminating in his surrender at the Battle of Saratoga on October 17, frustrated by his lack of support during the Philadelphia campaign. Howe tendered his resignation, which was accepted in October 1777. He was subsequently replaced as the Commander-in-Chief of British forces by Sir Henry Clinton. The ensuing year witnessed inconclusive battles around Pennsylvania and New Jersey, culminating in the Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778. However, a significant turning point in the war came in the spring of 1778 when the Continental Congress secured an alliance with Louis XV of France. King Louis XV of France, eager to humiliate the British after France's defeat in the 7 Years' War, committed to aiding the Americans despite risking the already fragile French economy. This choice would later fan the flames of the French Revolution. That same year, Sir Henry Clinton sought to regain control over the southern colonies, home to a significant loyalist population, and succeeded in capturing Savannah, Georgia. Indeed, the American Revolutionary War was not merely a rebellion against British rule. It was in many ways a civil war with friends and family often fighting on opposing sides. In 1780, Sir Henry Clinton led a 17,000-strong army into South Carolina and captured Charleston before splitting his forces and returning to New York, leaving the remaining troops under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis. This success put the southern colonies, along with New York, under British control, marking another low point for Washington and Congress. However, the tide began to turn in the summer of 1780, when the French, under the command of Marquis de Lafayette, sent much-needed supplies, arms, and troops. After wintering in New York in December 1780, Washington was persuaded by his French allies to target Lord Cornwallis in the south instead of focusing on Sir Henry Clinton in the north. Washington skillfully outmaneuvered Clinton with a feint and headed south. By the late summer of 1781, the French Navy defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's supply lines from New York. This strategic victory forced Cornwallis to surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in October 1781. The British withdrew from Savannah in 1782, and on September 3, 1783, a peace treaty was signed in Paris, marking the end of the war. By 1783, the last British troops had been evacuated from the 13 colonies. The British had always faced an uphill battle in their attempt to retain the colonies, being vastly outnumbered by the colonial population and dealing with supply lines that stretched thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Having fulfilled his duty, Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in December 1783 and returned to his estates at Mount Vernon the following year. In 1787, he was elected to preside over the Constitutional Convention, which led to the signing of the American Constitution on September 17. Despite his reluctance to engage in politics, Washington's leadership abilities were undeniable, making him a natural choice for the role. Washington, the respected war hero with notably neutral political views, emerged as the ideal candidate for the first president of the United States, His impartiality during the Constitutional Convention was highly appreciated, and it was no surprise when he won the first presidential election in 1789, with John Adams elected as vice president. Washington's first cabinet comprised key figures, including Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Nedman Randolph as Attorney General. His astute assignments ensured a balance between the two major political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, thus preserving the fragile Union. Recognized for his reserved, cautious approach, Washington sought to minimize risks and broker compromises between the often conflicting parties. Many agree that his neutrality during the transitional period helped to prevent a potential fracture or split between the rival parties. Despite disagreements within his own cabinet, such as the clash between Republican Jefferson and Federalist Hamilton over the creation of a national bank, Washington managed to keep the balance. The bank was established with Jefferson's agreement, on the condition that the nation's capital be moved to Georgetown in 1790. The city was later renamed Washington, D.C. in George Washington's honor in 1791. Amidst growing fears of centralizing power and compromising states' freedoms, the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights were ratified in December 1791. These documents, still regarded as foundational to American democracy, addressed the concerns of anti-federalists like Jefferson, ensuring the protection of various liberties. During his tenure, Washington also maintained America's neutrality during the French Revolutionary Wars and secured victory. Re-elected for a second term in 1793, his second term saw increased division within his cabinet, resulting in criticism from both Federalist and Republican press. While he sanctioned laws allowing slave owners to recover fugitive slaves, he also signed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, limiting the United States' involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Additionally, he signed an act to create the United States Navy. In 1797, he decided to retire to his estates at Vernon, Virginia, but his retirement was short-lived. Falling ill in December 1799, he died peacefully with his wife Martha by his side. George Washington, buried at Mount Vernon, is seen as an integral figure in American history. His leadership during the American Revolutionary War was pivotal, and despite early setbacks, he proved himself an extremely capable commander. While he is criticized for owning slaves, it is essential to remember the historical context. Washington's calm and cautious leadership brought stability to the early republic. His ability to unify rival political parties under his authority was unparalleled. Even today, over 200 years later, he remains an enduring symbol of unity and leadership for the people of the United States.